Her father knelt in the milk cellar with his hand pressed flat against the stone. She was 9. The walls smelled of sour lime and damp wool, and somewhere above them sheep bells moved through the fog like something lost finding its way home. He took her wrist and placed her palm beside his. "Feel," he said. The stone was not warm. It was not cold. It was still. "Stone does not make heat," he told her. "It keeps what the world wastes." She filed the lesson beside 100 others and forgot it for 28 years. Until the winter she had 2 children, no shelter, and a cave that breathed warm air into the dark. The roadhouse owner gave her until sundown. Thomas Calder had been dead 9 days, and the board he had paid in advance ran out 3 days ago. Crown and Finch Stage and Express called it driver error, a coach overturned on a frozen grade near Tallow Bluff, and refused compensation. Then they charged the widow for 3 weeks of lodging her husband had used while working their route. 9 days dead, and the company found a way to send a bill. Marit Brecke Calder stood in the narrow upstairs room with a trunk, 2 blankets, a cracked iron pot, her husband's leather awl, a dull felling axe, 6 hens in a crate by the door, and $21.40 after selling Thomas's watch. Eli, 12, sat on the trunk lid recording figures on a slate with chalk nubs. She had been coughing since November, a wet sound that rattled in her chest when she bent forward. Tolef, 7, stood behind the flour barrel near the wall, watching the door because the last man who knocked had come to collect. The math did not work. Every way Marit turned the numbers, they came apart. She owed Reuben Cass $12.60 at his store. She had no fare east. Thomas's death claim required Dakota Territory witnesses, which meant she could not leave without abandoning it entirely. And if she left, Cass could buy the claim and the company scrap uncontested. She could not go forward, could not go back, and had until the light failed to find somewhere else to stand. She walked the claim edge that afternoon with her children and met the first man who would tell her she was going to die. Amos Breyer was 63 years old, a retired stage station keeper who had run a road ranch on the Cheyenne to Deadwood line for 11 years before his knees gave out. He had seen coaches roll, horses freeze in harness, and men walk into blizzards believing they could find a door that was 30 feet away. He had buried 2 of them himself. When he heard a Norwegian widow was standing on a quarter section near Tallow Bluff with children and no shelter, he wrote out not from kindness but from the professional irritation of a man who had spent his life keeping people alive on the plains and could not stand watching someone do it wrong. He did not introduce himself gently. "Show me what you have," Amos said. Marit showed him. The claim held a half-finished dugout frame that Thomas had started before the company moved him to the Spearfish Road. The frame had no roof. 2 walls stood waist-high, the sod already crumbling where frost had worked into the cuts. Beside the frame sat a pile of split wood, 3/4 cord by Amos's eye, maybe less. He walked the site with his hands in his coat pockets, stopping at each feature the way a doctor stops at each wound. He kicked the sod wall, and a chunk fell inward. He counted the split logs and did not need long. "You need 8 cords of wood to get through a Black Hills winter with a stove that draws," Amos said. "You need a roof that does not breathe daylight. You need chinking, a working stovepipe, and a man's team to haul timber and sod. You have 3/4 cord, 1 axe, no horse, and 2 children." Marit said nothing. Eli wrote on the slate, 8 cords. "A dugout takes 3 weeks with help," Amos continued. "A log cabin needs straight timber and a team of oxen. A canvas shelter will kill you by Christmas. The stage road has 3 road ranches within 40 miles, and any of them would take you on as a cook or laundress through winter. That is what makes sense. And my claim? Marit asked. Your claim is dirt until you improve it, and you cannot improve it before the ground freezes. And my husband's death settlement? Amos looked at her. He had the expression of a man who understood the question and did not like the answer. Cass holds your credit. Cass brokers for Crown and Finch on the side. If you leave, Cass buys the claim and the scrap for what you owe, and the death settlement dies in a file. Then I cannot leave. Then you will die here. He said it without malice, the way a man states the temperature. That is the arithmetic. He left her a sack of dried beans from his saddlebag. He did not look at the children when he set it down. Marit did not sleep in the open dugout frame that night. She walked the claim in the last light, looking for anything Thomas had left that she had not already counted. The axe, the awl, a coil of rope with one frayed section, iron nails in a tin, 43 of them, some bent, a broken stove with one missing lid that Thomas had traded labor for and never finished installing, half a sack of lime gone powdery, and the coach. It sat below the limestone bluff where the grade turned, 300 yards from the dugout frame. A Concorde-type body, red paint streaked with mud, the front running gear shattered where it had struck a rock ledge at speed. Crown and Finch had stripped the mail fittings, the lamps, and the brass. They had taken the usable wheels. What remained was the wooden body, roughly 10 feet long, 6 feet wide, 8 feet high at the crown, leather strap suspension still attached to nothing, side panels intact, doors functional, glass cracked but present. 2,000 pounds of dead wood that the company had abandoned because hauling it out cost more than it was worth. Reuben Cass wanted the panels for resale. He had told Marit this on the second day after Thomas's death, the same conversation in which he had reminded her of her store debt and suggested her children might be better placed with proper families before winter. Marit stood below the coach in the cold and looked past it. Behind the wreck, the limestone bluff opened, a shallow cave mouth, 14 feet wide at the base, 9 feet high at the center, tapering irregularly into the rock. She could see perhaps 20 feet deep before the light failed. The ground inside was dry. The air that moved past her face carried no wind. She did not know yet what she was looking at. She only knew that the coach and the cave were both things the world had declared worthless, and she was a woman the world had declared the same. She went back to the dugout frame, wrapped her children in both blankets, and fed them beans she boiled in the cracked pot over a fire built from her 3/4 cord. Eli coughed through the night. Toluf slept with his head against the flour barrel. The fire ate wood that Marit could not replace. In the morning, she went back to the cave. She did not go with a plan. She went with Thomas's awl to pull upholstery tacks from the wrecked coach because tacks could be traded for salt or thread at Door's store. The morning was cold enough to sting her knuckles through thin gloves. Frost whitened the coach's windward panels. The grass outside the bluff stood stiff and brittle, but the moss near the limestone crack was soft. Marit stopped pulling tacks and looked at it. The moss grew in a line along the base of the bluff where the cave mouth began. She pressed her thumb into it. Damp, pliable. Everything 10 feet away was rigid with frost, and this moss bent under her nail. She stepped to the cave mouth and held her hand out, palm forward, the way she had held it 1,000 times against kitchen doors and cellar walls to check for draft. Air moved outward, not wind, nothing that could push a candle flame, but a slow, steady breath, warmer than the air on her face. The memory came without invitation. She was 9 years old, standing in a stone milk cellar in Telemark. Her father, Oddmund Brecke, knelt beside her with his hand pressed flat against the lime-washed wall. The cellar smelled of sour milk and damp wool. Sheep bells rang somewhere above them through the fog. Feel, her father said. She pressed her palm beside his. The stone was not warm. It was not cold. It was still. Stone does not make heat, Odman said. It keeps what the world wastes. Air changes in an hour. Stone changes in a season. When the wind takes everything from the house, it takes nothing from the cellar. You understand? She had nodded without understanding. She was 9. She filed it beside 100 other things her father said about walls, moss, draft, and lime. The vocabulary of a man who had spent his life sealing cold out of stone rooms. Now she was 37, standing in front of a limestone cave in Dakota Territory, and the vocabulary came back complete. She tore a scrap from a flour sack she carried and hung it across the cave mouth with 2 tacks. Outside wind snapped the cloth sideways, flattening it against the rock. Inside, the cloth lifted slowly outward. The cave was breathing. Marit set a tin cup of water 3 paces inside the cave and left it overnight. She set a bucket outside, 10 feet from the entrance. In the morning, the bucket had skinned over with ice a 1/4 inch thick. The cup had a rim of frost, but liquid water in the center. Eli recorded both on the slate. Outside hard, cave soft. The idea did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as arithmetic. The cave held warmth the way her father's cellar had, not by making heat, but by refusing to let it go. The limestone walls sat at roughly 50 degrees, a temperature that would not freeze water, not burn fuel, not keep children warm by itself. But 50 degrees was not 20 below zero. 50 degrees was the difference between survival and death, if she could keep the wind from stealing it. The coach was 10 feet long, 6 feet wide, 8 feet high. The cave mouth was 14 feet wide, 9 feet high. If she could move the coach body backward into the mouth, it would fill most of the opening. The gaps between coach and limestone, irregular, wider on the west side, narrow at the east shoulder, could be packed with stone, clay, moss, and brush until no air moved through them. The cave behind would become the warm air reservoir. The coach would become the sleeping chamber and weather door. A small vent near the roof line would let smoke out when the stove was used sparingly, and the cave's natural outward breath would help push it. She would not need 8 cords of wood. She would need enough to cook and take the edge off the coldest nights, because the cave would do the rest. She would not need a dugout, a cabin, a team of oxen, or a man. She would need clay, stone, moss, rope, 2 pry bars, time she did not have, and strength she was not sure she possessed. Marit sat on a flat rock at the cave mouth and wrote the design in the dirt with a stick. Coach here. Stone wall here and here. Vent gap here. Drainage trench along the cave floor. Stove inside the coach body, pipe angled toward the vent. Food stored on the deeper cave shelf, where the temperature held steadiest. She erased the drawing with her boot before she left. She was not ready to be told it was impossible by anyone other than herself. But doubt found her anyway. It came wearing a flour-dusted apron and carrying the heel of a bread loaf. Mercy Vale was 32, a laundress and mother of 4, whose husband hauled freight between Deadwood and Rapid City and was gone more than he was present. Mercy did not visit out of cruelty. She visited because she'd buried a child 2 winters before and recognized the arithmetic of a woman running out of options. She brought bread because bread was what she had. She found Marit measuring the coach width with knotted twine, Eli holding one end while Tolliff counted knots. "What are you measuring?" Mercy asked. "The coach." "I can see it is the coach. What are you measuring it for?" Marit hesitated. Then she told her. She described the cave air, the frost line, the moss, the tin cup test. The design. She described it plainly without enthusiasm, the way a carpenter describes a joint. Mercy listened. She looked at the cave mouth. She looked at the coach. She looked at Marit's hands, which were raw from pulling tacks and splitting the last of the firewood. "You will dam a cave with a coach," Mercy said. "I will seal a cave mouth with a coach body and stone walls." "Where does smoke go?" "Out a vent at the roof line. The cave breathes outward. I tested it." "Where does water go when the thaw comes?" Marit paused. "I will need a drainage trench." "And when the clay cracks?" "Clay always cracks." "I do not have an answer for that yet." Mercy set the bread on the coach step. "Marit, I buried my Anna in ground I had to chop with a mattock because it was frozen 2 feet down. I carried her out of a cabin that had a roof and 4 walls and a stove that drew properly, and the cold still took her. You want to bury your children behind mud and call it shelter. I want to keep them alive. So did I." Mercy left. She did not look back. The bread sat on the step, cooling in the wind. Marit split it into 2 pieces and gave them to Eli and Tolef. She did not eat. She went back to the cave mouth and pressed her hand against the limestone the way her father had pressed his hand against the cellar wall 30 years before. The stone was still. It did not care about Mercy's doubt or Marit's fear. It only held its temperature, patient and indifferent, the way it had held it for 1,000 years before anyone built a road or rolled a coach or buried a child in frozen ground. She could not answer Mercy's question about the clay. She did not know yet, but the stone she could trust. At Door's store the next morning, Marit asked for 4 items: damaged hemp rope, old axle grease gone too rancid for wheels, 2 bent pry bars that sat rusting behind the harness rack, and flour sacking, the coarse kind used to wrap freight, not the fine weave for baking. Door did not ask why. He was a quiet man who sold what people wanted and did not volunteer opinions about their chances. He quoted her prices. The rope was 30 cents. The grease was free because no one wanted it. The pry bars were 40 cents for the pair. The flour sacking was 15 cents a yard, and she needed 6 yards. Marit counted the money twice. Each purchase subtracted from $21.40, and the $12.60 she owed Cass at his store across the road sat on top of everything like a stone on a grave. Reuben Cass heard her voice from the back of Door's store, where he was pricing salt pork with a freighter named Grohl. Cass was 46, soft-bodied and hard-eyed, the kind of man who had learned that owning debt was more profitable than owning land. He brokered claims for Crown and Finch on the side, bought distressed property when families broke, and carried a ledger that held more power in the territory than most men's rifles. He did not need Marit's claim. He wanted it because it was cheap and she was weak, and that combination was his entire livelihood. He walked to the counter where Marit was coiling the rope. "Rope, grease, pry bars, and flour sacking," Cass said, loudly enough for Grohl and 2 other men near the stove to hear. "What are you building, Mrs. Calder? A raft?" "What I am building is my concern." "Your concern runs through my ledger." $12.60, plus the board Crown and Finch billed for Thomas's weeks at the roadhouse. You are not buying supplies. You are deepening a hole. The men by the stove watched. Grohl leaned against the salt pork barrel and said nothing. "I'm buying rope and tools," Marit said. "I'm paying Door, not you." Cass smiled. It was the smile of a man holding cards he had not yet played. "I heard you have been spending time at that wrecked coach below the bluff, measuring it, hanging cloth from the rocks." Someone had watched. Someone had told Cass. The territory was small enough that a widow's movements were public news. "She's building a parlor for ghosts," Cass said to the men by the stove. One of them laughed. Grohl did not. Cass stepped closer and lowered his voice, though not enough. "I have a company notice from Crown and Finch. That coach is abandoned, but not free. Anyone removing fittings owes salvage value. I could file on those tacks you pulled yesterday." The company stripped the coach and left the body. "The company left it because it was not worth hauling. That does not make it yours." He straightened. "I can settle this. Your debt, the coach, the claim improvements Thomas started, all of it cleared. I will take the coach, the hens, and the improvements. You walk clean." "Walk where?" "East, or to a road ranch. There are positions for women. Your girl is old enough to work. The boy could be placed with a family in Deadwood who has asked for a child his age." The store went silent. Even the man who had laughed stopped. Marit's hands tightened on the rope. She could feel the twist of the hemp against her blistered palms, and she could feel something else, the precise weight of what Cass was offering. He was not threatening her children directly. He was describing a world in which her failure was assumed, and the placement of her children was a kindness rather than a cruelty. He was building the story of her collapse before it happened, so that when it came, it would seem inevitable. "I will keep my children," Marit said. "I will keep my claim. I will keep my debt until I can pay it. And you will leave this store before I decide whether to tell Dorr what Crown and Finch pays you for brokering claims they have no right to sell." Cass's face changed. Not anger, calculation. He was recalculating the cost of breaking her openly versus waiting for winter to do it. 10 days, he said. "I will file on that coach salvage in 10 days. Whatever you're building, Mrs. Calder, build it fast." He left. The door banged shut behind him. The stove men looked at their boots. Dorr finished wrapping the flour sacking without a word. He added a ball of heavy twine to the bundle and did not charge for it. It was the only help she received that day, and she could not afford to acknowledge it, because acknowledging kindness in front of witnesses would confirm that she needed it. The gossip spread in 3 days, carried by the same current that moved every piece of information through the territory, the slow, reliable circulation of people who had nothing to do but watch each other. On the first day, 2 boys followed Marit and Tolef to the bluff, singing a song they had composed about Mrs. Stagecoach, who lived underground with bats. Tolef hid behind the coach body. Eli threw a stone that missed the boys by the distance she intended and told them to leave. They left, but the song persisted. On the second day, a road driver named Sullivan refused to lend Merritt the use of his ox team for an hour. He was apologetic about it. "Cass holds my account," Sullivan said. "If I help you, I lose my credit. I am sorry. I have 4 children." On the third day, a churchwoman whose name Marit never learned left a pair of old mittens on the dugout frame without knocking, without speaking, and without meeting Marit's eyes. The mittens were too large and smelled of lye soap. Marit put them on. Her own gloves had torn at the thumbs from pulling tacks and rolling stones. The town believed she was going mad. A widow hauling river clay to a wrecked coach below a limestone cave. What else could it be? Grief had broken her. The cold would finish it. The children would end up placed, and Cass would get the claim, and the story would become another cautionary tale about women who tried to hold land alone. Marit knew what they were saying. She knew because Eli told her, and Eli told her because Eli was 12 and could read a room faster than most adults. Eli reported the gossip with the flat precision of a court recorder. Who said what, where, and who was listening? "They think you are building a coffin," Eli said. They are wrong. Are you sure? Marit stopped rolling a stone toward the pile she was building near the cave mouth. She looked at her daughter. Eli's face was thin, her cheekbones sharper than they had been a month ago, and the cough sat in her chest like a tenant who had no intention of leaving. No, Marit said. I am not sure, but the arithmetic says the cave is warmer than anything else I can build in 10 days with no horse and no help. If the arithmetic is wrong, we die. If the arithmetic is right, we live. I do not have a third choice. Eli picked up the slate. Then we should count faster. The first task was moving the coach. 2,000 pounds of wood, iron, and leather, sitting on bare ground with no wheels, no axles, no team. The cave mouth was 300 yards from where the wreck had settled, and the grade between them rose slightly before leveling at the bluff base. Marit could not drag it. She could not lift it. She could not will it to move by staring at it the way Toluf stared at it every morning, as though hoping the coach might decide to cooperate. She cut 6 straight pine rollers from deadfall timber in the draw below the claim. Each log was 6 to 8 inches thick, the largest she could handle with the dull felling axe. Cutting them took a full day, her shoulders burned by the third log. The axe handle, already dry and splitting, cracked further at the neck. She wrapped it with wet rawhide and prayed it would hold. The method was simple in principle. Pry one corner of the coach up an inch, slide a flat stone underneath, pry the next corner, block it. Once all 4 corners sat on stone, roll a pine log under the front edge, then the rear, and lever the whole body forward. 1 inch at a time, 1 corner at a time, 1 hour at a time. In practice, it nearly killed her on the first afternoon. The pry bar slipped on frozen ground while she was lifting the front left corner. The coach dropped. The bar whipped sideways and struck her forearm hard enough to raise a welt the width of a finger. She sat in the dirt, holding her arm and breathing through her teeth while Toluf watched with eyes the size of the tin cup in the cave. She got up. She set the bar again. She blocked before she rested, because a load that is not blocked is a load that is waiting to crush someone. By the end of the first day, the coach had moved 18 inches. Eli counted the roller turns. Toluf carried wedge stones smaller than his forearm and placed them where Marit pointed. The 3 of them worked until the light died, and then Marit fed the children beans and the last of Mercy's bread, and they slept in the dugout frame under both blankets while the fire consumed wood she could not spare. The second day was worse. Rain came, not heavy, but steady, a cold drizzle that turned the ground slick under the rollers. The coach slid sideways on one pass and jammed against a stone outcrop. Marit spent an hour realigning it with the pry bar and a fulcrum stone, her hands so cold she could not feel the iron. By the end of the second day, the coach had moved 4 feet. She was behind. She was always behind. The 10 days Cass had given her were not a deadline she could negotiate, and winter was not a creditor she could charm. Every hour she spent moving the coach was an hour she was not cutting wood, not gathering clay, not building the wall that would seal the gaps between coach and limestone. The work multiplied faster than she could do it. On the third day, a woman watched her from the ridge. Marit did not see her at first. She was resetting a roller that had kicked loose, her face close to the ground, her breath fogging the iron bar. When she looked up to wipe mud from her eyes, she saw a figure on the bluff trail, a woman on a sway-backed horse, sitting motionless, watching. The woman did not wave. She did not call down. She sat and watched Marit block the coach, reposition the roller, set the bar, and lever. She watched Marit fail to move it. She watched Marit reset. She watched Marit fail again. She watched Marit block the load before resting. Then the woman rode down. Her name was Barbro Assen. She was 59 years old. Norwegian born like Marit, a widow twice over, once from a lime burner in Minnesota, once from a carpenter in Yankton who drank himself quiet. She had come west following kin who did not want her, and she had stayed because she had nowhere to go back to. She was a midwife when there were babies to deliver, a root cellar builder when there were cellars to build, and a woman who knew more about stone, lime, and cold than anyone within a day's ride, because her father had burned lime for a living, and she had spent her childhood watching calciumite become calcium oxide in kilns that could blister skin at 20 paces. She dismounted and walked to where Marit stood catching her breath beside the jammed coach. "You blocked before you rested," Barbro said. "What?" "You blocked the load before you sat down. That is the test. A fool rests and lets the load settle where it wants. You caught it first." She looked at the rollers, the flat stones, the pry bar. "You are trying to move this coach into that cave." "I am." "Alone?" "With my children." Barbro looked at Eli, who was recording roller counts on the slate, and Tolef, who was stacking wedge stones in a line like a boy setting up tin soldiers. She looked at the cave mouth, black and steady behind the wreck. She put her hand against the limestone the way a person touches a wall they have known before. "This rock breathes," Barbro said. "I know." "Your father was a stone man?" "He kept cellars in Telemark." Barbro nodded slowly. "My father burned lime. Same stone, different fire." She looked at the coach, then at the cave, then at Marit's swollen hands wrapped in lye soap mittens. "You cannot move this alone, not in 10 days, not with pine rollers on wet ground in a bar that size." "I know. I have a block and tackle in my shed. It belonged to my second husband, and he has finished using it." She said it without sentiment, the way people who have survived multiple losses learn to speak about the dead, with precision rather than grief. She did not offer the block and tackle. She stated that she had it. The offer was Marit's to ask for. "I cannot pay you," Marit said. "I did not ask for payment. I asked whether you knew you could not do this alone." Barbro untied her horse and looked at Marit with eyes that held no softness and no hardship, only the steady measuring gaze of a woman deciding whether another woman was worth her time. "I will bring the tackle tomorrow. If you have moved this coach another foot by the time I arrive, I will help you. If you have not, I will take my tackle home, and you will not see me again." She rode up the bluff trail without looking back. Marit turned to the coach. The light was failing. Her arm throbbed where the pry bar had struck it. Eli was coughing. Tolef had run out of wedge stones. She picked up the bar, set it against the coach frame, positioned the fulcrum stone, and pushed. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever been doubted by someone who could not see what you were building yet? The coach moved. Not much. An inch, then 2. She blocked it, reset, pushed again. The roller turned under the frame with a groan that sounded almost human. Mud squeezed out from under the pine log. The coach crept forward. By full dark, she had gained another 14 inches. Her hands were bleeding through the mittens. Eli had stopped counting and was heating stones in the fire to warm Tolef's feet. The beans were gone. Tomorrow she would need to trade tacks for food, which meant time away from the coach, which meant time she did not have. But the coach was closer to the cave than it had been that morning, and somewhere on the bluff trail, a woman with a block and tackle was deciding whether Marit Calder was worth the rope. The wind picked up after midnight. It came from the north, crossing the open prairie with nothing to slow it, and it hit the dugout frame like a hand testing a door. The blankets were not enough. Eli curled around Tolef and coughed into her sleeve. Marit lay awake and listened to the canvas she had hung across the dugout, opening snap and billow, and she thought about the cave, dark, still, 50 degrees up, where the wind had never reached and the tin cup stayed liquid while the world outside turned to iron. 7 days left before Cass filed his claim. The coach still sat 295 feet from where it needed to be. The wall had not been started. The drainage trench existed only as a line scratched in the dirt. The stove had no pipe. The clay had not been dug. And the winter that would decide everything had already begun sending its scouts across the ridge, cold nights sharpening into colder ones, frost climbing the bluff face an inch higher each morning, the grass dying in waves that moved south like something retreating from a thing it did not want to face. Marit closed her eyes. She could hear the limestone breathing if she listened hard enough, that slow exhalation of warmer air from the cave mouth, invisible and steady, the only thing between her family and the open sky. She would move the coach tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The stone did not hurry, neither would she. Barbro Asen came back at dawn with the block and tackle slung across her saddle and a coil of rope that smelled like tallow and old barn. She did not greet Marit. She walked to the coach, studied the ground where the rollers sat, and measured the distance Marit had gained overnight with her boot heel. 14 inches, Barbro said. 15. Barbro looked at Marit's hands. The mittens were stiff with dried blood at the palms. The pry bar leaned against the coach frame with mud frozen to its jaw. The rollers were gouged where the iron coach hardware had bitten into the pine. 15, Barbro agreed. She tied the block and tackle to a pine stump 30 feet ahead of the coach and ran the rope back through a bridle ring bolted to the frame. Then she looked at Marit the way a woman looks at a wall she's about to build, assessing weight, angle, and what would break first. I will teach you 4 things. If you learn them, you will live. If you do not, this coach will bury you before the cold does. The first lesson was lever and cribbing discipline. Barbro kicked away the flat stone Marit had been using as a fulcrum and replaced it with a wider, thicker slab she pulled from the bluff rubble. A round stone rolls, a thin stone cracks, a wide stone holds. Every time you pry, you set the catch stone first. Every time you set the catch stone, you test it with your boot. If it shifts, find another. Never pry without a catch. Never trust a round log on frozen ground. Lift an inch, block an inch. The woman who lifts 2 inches and blocks 1 is the woman who dies under the load. She demonstrated. She positioned the bar, levered the coach corner up exactly 1 inch, slid a stone block into the gap, and released. The coach settled onto the block without shifting. She did it again, and again. Each time the coach rose an inch, a block appeared beneath it. The rhythm was slow and maddening and completely safe. Speed kills, Barbro said. Patience only hurts. By midday, the block and tackle had changed the arithmetic. What Marit had moved 4 feet in 2 days, they moved 6 feet in 4 hours. The tackle multiplied force. The rollers carried weight. Barbro's cribbing discipline kept the coach from killing them at every pause. Eli fed rope through the block, while Tolef carried catch stones. They worked in a line, Barbro directing, Marit hauling, the children supporting, and the coach crept toward the cave mouth like something remembering where it belonged. By day 5, the coach had moved from its resting place to the base of the grade below the bluff. 40 feet covered, 255 to go. But the grade leveled here, and the ground was harder, and the rollers bit into frozen dirt instead of slipping on mud. The pace would quicken. Marit did the math on Eli's slate each night. Feet per day. Days remaining, feet left. The numbers were still wrong, but they were less wrong than they had been. The second lesson came on day 6, when Marit began gathering moss for the wall. She pulled it from the creek bank and the base of deadfall logs, wringing it out and packing it into flour sacks. Barbro watched her stack the wet moss against a plank and shook her head. "Dry moss goes against wood and rock first," Barbro said. "Not wet clay. Wet clay shrinks when it dries. It cracks. You have seen a mud puddle in August. Hard surface, deep fractures, useless as a seal. Moss does not crack. Moss compresses. Moss fills the space clay leaves behind. You pack dry moss against the wood, press it into every joint and crack, then lay clay over the moss. The moss is the gasket. The clay is the skin. What if the moss rots? Moss rots in warmth and wet. Inside a wall between stone and clay, it stays dry and pressed. My father sealed lime kilns with moss gaskets that lasted 20 years. The kiln burned at temperatures that would melt your stove. The moss held because it was protected. Marit repacked the moss. She laid it against a test section of the coach's side panel, dry, pressed tight with her thumbs into every gap between wood and limestone, and then troweled clay over it with her bare hands. The difference was immediate. The wet moss she had tried first sat loose against the wood and wept moisture through the clay. The dry moss gripped the surface and held the clay in place like mortar behind a brick. Eli recorded the test on the slate. Dry moss holds. Wet moss weeps. The third lesson arrived with the first section of wall. Marit had begun packing the west gap, the wider side, where the coach body sat 3 feet from the limestone, with clay and stone. She built it the way she had seen sod walls built. Clay packed thick against the rock, more clay on the outside, a skin of mud smoothed with a board. Barbro tore a section out with her hands. The clay slumped where she pulled it, collapsing inward like bread that had not risen. There was nothing behind it, no structure, no skeleton. Just clay leaning against rock, waiting for its own weight to bring it down. A mud wall without stone slumps, Barbro said. She was not gentle about it. Big stones bridge the gap. Small stones lock between the big ones. Clay only binds and seals. You're building a skin with no bones. The first hard freeze will crack it, and the first thaw will bring it down. She showed Marit how. Large flat stones set vertically across the gap, their faces wedged against both the coach panel and the limestone wall. Smaller stones packed between them, filling the irregular spaces. Then clay pressed into every remaining crack, binding the stone mass into a solid unit. Then moss gasket against the wood. Then a final clay skin on the outside. The wall was ugly. It looked like something a river had deposited rather than something a person had built. But when Barbro pushed against it, nothing moved. When Marit kicked the base, the shock traveled through stone, not clay. The wall did not flex. It held like the bluff it was attached to, because it was built from the same material in the same way. Stone hearting, Barbro said. Remember the phrase, big stones bridge, small stones lock, clay binds. That is the order. If you reverse it, you build a wall that falls. If you follow it, you build a wall that holds. They rebuilt the west section in 2 days, 18 inches thick at the side gaps, 24 inches at the base where the load was heaviest, 12 inches at the narrower east shoulder where the coach body sat closer to the rock. Every stone was placed, checked, and wedged. Every moss gasket was pressed dry into the wood joints before the clay went over it. Marit's hands ached deep into the bones, a pain that lived below the blisters in the raw skin in the tendons themselves. By day 9, the rear panel of the coach entered the cave's shade. The temperature difference was immediate. Frost still whitened the front of the coach where morning sun had not yet reached, but the rear panel was dry. The stone behind it radiated nothing, neither warmth nor cold. It simply refused to change. The fourth lesson was the one that would save them. Barbro brought a candle stub and told Marit to hold it near the gap she had left at the roof line, where the coach crown did not meet the limestone ceiling. The gap was roughly 8 inches wide and ran the width of the cave mouth, their vent, the only opening besides the coach doors where air could move. "Light it," Barbro said. Marit lit the candle and held it near the gap. The flame leaned outward. Not strongly, a gentle, steady pull toward the open air, as though the cave were exhaling through the slot. "Good," Barbro said. "The cave breathes out. When you light the stove, smoke rises to the ceiling, hits the vent, and the cave's breath pushes it outside." "But," she held up a finger, "when the wind changes, when a storm comes from the north and presses against the bluff face, the vent pressure reverses. The cave cannot breathe out because the wind is pushing in. Smoke stays. Smoke fills the coach. Smoke kills faster than cold. What do I do?" "You test the smoke before you trust the fire. Every time the wind shifts, hold a candle to the vent before you load the stove. If the flame leans inward, do not build a fire. Use blankets. Use warmed stones from the last fire. Use the cave's own temperature. 50 degrees will not freeze you. Smoke at midnight will kill you." She made Marit repeat it. "Hold the candle. Watch the lean. Inward means danger. Outward means draw. When in doubt, no fire. When the wind changes, test the smoke before you trust the fire," Marit said. Barbro nodded. "That is the rule that separates the living from the buried." By day 12, one full side gap was filled waist high with stone-hearted wall, and the opposite side reached shoulder height. The undercarriage gaps, the wheel wells, the broken hub sockets, the axle pockets where the running gear had been stripped, were packed with moss, stone chips, clay, and straw. The broken wheel hubs vanished under mud and flat stone. The coach floor was swept clean, and the benches inside had been unbolted and repositioned as sleeping platforms at different heights, one for Marit, one shared by the children. The setbacks accumulated alongside the progress. Rain came on day 8 and soaked the clay pile before the freeze. Barbro showed Marit how to cover the pile with brush and sacking, but the damage was done. A full day's worth of mixed clay turned to slurry and ran down the bluff. They had to dig more from the creek bank and haul it uphill in flour sacks, a task that cost Marit and Eli 4 hours they could not spare. On day 10, Marit found a rope cut clean at the coach's rear bridle ring, not frayed, cut. A knife had been through it during the night. She did not accuse Cass because she could not prove it, but Barbro looked at the cut end and said nothing, which said everything. They re-rigged with Barbro's rope and added a knot that could not be severed without waking someone. On day 11, the coach tilted. A roller split under the frame while Marit and Barbro were levering the front end over a stone ridge. The body dropped 4 inches on the left side and slid toward the bluff wall. Barbro was crouching near the left rear corner, checking the moss gasket she had packed that morning. The coach frame swung toward her. Marit shouted. Barbro threw herself backward, and the iron corner bracket passed over her boot by less than a hand's width. They lay in the dirt, breathing hard, and Barbro said, "That is why you block before you rest." They righted the coach with the tackle, replaced the split roller, and lost half a day. By day 14, Tolef developed a fever. It was not the deep cough that lived in Eli's chest. It was the hot, dry misery of a child who had been sleeping in an open dugout frame in November weather and eating beans without enough fat. Marit carried him to the coach interior, wrapped him in both blankets on the sleeping platform, and heated a stone in the fire to put near his feet. The cave air behind the coach was 52 degrees by the tin cup test. Outside, The morning frost was hard enough to crack puddles underfoot. Eli hid something from Marit. She hid it for 3 days. On the fourth day, Barbara heard it, a wet rattle deep in Eli's chest when she bent to stack stones. The November cough had not left. It had settled deeper, waited, and returned. Both of them sick and the wall not finished, Barbara said quietly when the children could not hear. How much time? 4 days to the top, 2 to seal. The weather says 2 days to the first real gale, maybe 3. Marit closed her eyes. The arithmetic was wrong again. It was always wrong. She opened her eyes and picked up a stone. Unexpected help came as silence. On day 15, Marit found 2 sacks of chopped straw at the base of the bluff trail. No note. No name. The straw was clean, dry, and cut to the right length for mixing into clay. Mercyvale's laundry line was visible from the bluff, and the sacks were the same flour sacking Mercy used to wrap clean shirts for delivery. Marit said nothing about it. She mixed the straw into clay and built the east shoulder to full height. 2 days later, Mercy came openly. She came because Tollef's fever had not broken, and because a mother who has lost a child cannot hear about another child's fever and stay away, regardless of what she thinks about the mother's plan. She found Eli twisting moss ropes alone while Marit packed the upper wall, and she sat down beside Eli and twisted moss without speaking. After an hour, she said, "Show me the gasket pattern." Eli showed her. Mercy twisted 4 ropes before dark. Amos Breyer reappeared on day 16. He rode to the bluff, dismounted, and stood before the cave mouth with his arms folded. The coach body was seated in the opening. The side walls rose to head height, ragged on the outside, dense and solid behind the clay skin. The vent gap at the top showed a thin strip of black where the cave breathed outward. The coach doors opened and closed. Inside on the sleeping platform, Tollef was wrapped in blankets, and Eli was writing on the slate by candlestub. Amos touched the west wall. He pressed it with his palm. He kicked the base. He leaned his weight against the east shoulder and pushed. Nothing moved. "I called this a coffin," Amos said. "You did. The walls are better than half the road station walls I built. The mosswork is tight." He paused. "But ordinary houses fail at the roof and chimney. You have built a house where the roof is a cliff and the chimney is a guess. One bad crosswind and the smoke fills this box. One deep freeze cracks the clay skin. One thaw sends water down the bluff face and into the wall." "I know." "You know, and you have your children in there." "My children are warmer in there than they were in the dugout frame." "Tollef's fever broke last night. The cave holds 52 degrees when the outside drops below freezing. I can keep a small fire when the vent draws, and I do not need a fire when the vent does not, because the cave does not drop below 45 even at midnight." Amos looked at her for a long time. "You sound like a woman who has been counting." "I have been counting since the day my husband died. I have not stopped." He left without saying she would live. He left without saying she would die. He left a sack of cornmeal on the coach step, which was as close to an admission of uncertainty as Amos Breyer had ever come. By early January of 1887, the cave coach was sealed. The side walls stood 18 inches thick on the west, 24 at the base, 12 at the narrow east shoulder. The undercarriage spaces were buried under stone, moss, and clay. The vent gap ran the width of the ceiling, 8 inches wide, and on still days the candle flame leaned outward with the patience of a thing that had been breathing for 10,000 years. The drainage trench ran along the inside cave wall, sloped toward a gravel pocket near the entrance where water could seep rather than pool. Barbro had insisted on the trench during the first week, and the first heavy rain had proven her right. Water ran down the bluff face, hit the wall, and followed the trench to the gravel instead of flooding the floor. The coach interior was no longer a coach. The sleeping platforms held bedding, the underseat boots, the storage compartments below the bench seats held flour, beans, cornmeal, and the dried remains of 2 hens Marit had butchered when it became clear she could not feed them through winter. The stove sat near the front with its pipe angled toward the vent. A flour sack curtain divided the sleeping space from the entry. Marit and Eli conducted tests. The candle held steady inside while wind stripped snow from the bluff face outside. The tin cups stayed liquid overnight at 3 paces. The coach floor was dry. The stove drew well when the wind came from the south or west, which was most days, and the candle warned when the wind shifted north. It was not warm. It was not comfortable. It was not anything a sane person would choose if they had a choice. But no one had offered Marit a choice, and the numbers said what they said. 52 degrees in the deep pocket, 48 on cold nights near the coach door, never below 45. Outside, the world was dying. Cass had not filed his salvage claim. Marit learned later that his Deadwood contact had told him the claim was weak. The company had stripped the coach and abandoned it publicly, and Marit's improvements made it a dwelling, not salvage. But Cass had not given up. He had changed strategies. He no longer needed the coach. He needed Marit to fail, so the claim would revert, and the story would confirm what he had already told the territory, that a widow alone could not hold land. Mercy worried about damp lungs. She came every few days now, sometimes with straw, sometimes with nothing except the company of a woman who had decided to stop pretending she was not watching. And Barbro was weakening. She had ridden to a road ranch 3 days before Christmas to deliver a baby ice, a freighter's wife who had gone into labor early. The ride was 15 miles in cutting wind. Barbro delivered the child, stayed 2 nights, and rode back. When she arrived at the bluff, she dismounted slowly and coughed into a handkerchief she tucked into her coat before Marit could see it. But Marit saw the edge of it. Pink, not red, not yet. Pink. She said nothing. Barbro would not have allowed the conversation. On the last day before the storm, Barbro sat inside the coach and watched Marit test the candle at the vent. The flame leaned outward. The stove drew. The cave breathed. "When the wind changes," Barbro said, "test the smoke before you trust the fire." "I know. You know. But knowing in daylight and knowing at midnight with a sick child and no light are not the same knowing. The wind will change. The smoke will come. You will want the fire because the fire is comfort and the dark is fear. Do not trust the comfort. Trust the candle." Marit nodded. The cave breathed outward, steady and indifferent, and the candle flame bent toward a sky that was already turning the color of iron. If you are invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because the next choice Marit makes decides whether the shelter saves them or poisons them. The storm did not arrive. It struck. A freighter named Grohl, the same man who had stood silently by the salt pork barrel in Door's store while Cass mocked Marit, staggered into town on the afternoon of January 12th with frost burns on both cheeks and a mule that had gone blind in one eye from ice. He said the sky north of the bluffs had gone black at midday, and the temperature had fallen faster than anything he had felt in 20 years of running freight on the northern plains. He said the wind did not blow. It arrived like a wall of moving ice, and everything in front of it died or found a door. By nightfall, the stage road disappeared under a sheet of driven snow that erased the ruts as though they had never been cut. The wind came from the north-northwest and hit the bluff country at angles that found every crack in every cabin, every gap in every chinking line, every loose board and badly seated stovepipe collar. Temperatures fell through zero and kept going. By midnight, the world outside the walls was a place where exposed skin did not sting. It burned, a cold so deep it confused the body into feeling heat. Cattle drifted into draws and died standing up. A dugout 4 miles south of Tallow Bluff lost its vent cover to a gust, and the family inside, a man, his wife, and 3 children, woke to a room filling with driven snow through a hole the size of a dinner plate. The man climbed out to replace the cover and could not find his door again. His wife pulled him back by the rope he had tied around his waist, and he lost 2 fingers on his left hand to the 20 seconds he spent exposed. Inside the cave coach, Marit heard the storm arrive as a change in pressure. The canvas flap over the outer entrance bowed inward and held, pressed flat by wind. The coach walls creaked, not the stone walls, which held silent, but the wooden panels of the coach body itself, flexing against the limestone frame like a ship flexing against a dock. The candle by the vent flickered. Marit watched it. The flame leaned outward. The cave was still breathing. She fed the stove. 1 split log, not 2. And the smoke rose, hit the vent, and disappeared into the gap. The draw held. Eli's cough was worse. The rattle had settled into a rhythm, a wet, percussive sound that came every 3 or 4 breaths and shook her thin shoulders. Marit heated a stone on the stove and wrapped it in cloth and pressed it against Eli's chest. Tolliff sat on his platform with his knees drawn up and his eyes wide, listening to the wind test the walls the way a boy listens to something large moving outside a door he cannot lock. The first night passed. The clay wall groaned once, near midnight, a low, shifting sound that brought Marit upright from the sleeping platform with her heart slamming. She pressed her palm to the west wall moss line, the way her father had pressed his palm to the cellar wall. She felt no knife of cold air, no draft, no crack had opened. The sound was the wall settling, stone adjusting against stone, as the temperature differential between the warm inner cave and the frozen outer skin found its equilibrium. The wall was doing what walls do. It was holding. Small dust fell from the upper west seam where the clay met the limestone ceiling. Marit brushed it away with her fingers and felt the moss gasket beneath. Compressed, dry, tight against the rock. Barbro's gasket held where clay alone would have cracked. She did not sleep again. Near 3 in the morning, the wind reversed. It came from the northeast now, swinging around the bluff face and driving directly into the vent gap. The candle flame snapped inward. Smoke from the dying stove fire curled back down from the ceiling, pooling in the upper third of the coach interior like fog settling into a valley. Marit killed the fire. She raked the coals into the ash pan and sealed the stove door. She opened the vent wider by pulling a moss plug from the far end of the gap. Cold air rushed in, sharp, biting, immediate, but it pushed the smoke cloud toward the cave interior, where it thinned and dissipated into the larger space. Eli coughed harder. The smoke had reached her lungs before Marit could clear it, and the coughing came in waves now, bending Eli forward on the platform until she gagged. Tolliff pressed his hands over his ears. The sound of his sister choking was worse than the sound of the wind. "Move deeper," Marit said. She picked up Tolliff and guided Eli by the shoulder, past the flour sack curtain, into the cave beyond the coach. The air here was still, 52 degrees, no smoke. The cave's own breath was pulling the last of it outward through side cracks in the limestone that Marit had not even known existed, tiny fissures that acted as secondary vents, too small to let wind in, but large enough to let smoke out. She spread a blanket on the cave floor and sat her children on it. The stone under them was cool, but not cold. The air did not move. The wind that was tearing shingles off cabins 4 miles away did not exist here. It had never existed here. The limestone did not care about the storm. It held its temperature the way it had held it when there were no people and no coaches and no roads. Patient, massive, and utterly indifferent. Marit went back to the coach and watched the candle. The flames still leaned inward. The wind was still pressing from the north. She could not use the stove. She could not light a fire. She could heat the stones left over from the last fire, but they would cool in an hour, and after that there was nothing between her family and the cold, except the cave itself. She heated every stone she had. She carried them wrapped in cloth to the children. She sealed the flour sack curtain against the cave floor with a rolled blanket. And she waited. Dawn came gray and howling, and with it came a sound Marit did not expect. Fists on the outer coach door. She opened it to find Reuben Cass, standing in the lee of the bluff wall with snow caked to his coat, and his face the color of ash. His lips were split from cold. His right hand was gloveless. He had lost the glove somewhere between his store and the bluff, a quarter-mile he should never have attempted in the dark. "My stovepipe broke," Cass said. His voice was stripped of everything she had ever heard in it, the mockery, the calculation, the quiet menace of a man who owned other people's debts. He was shaking. He was a man who was going to die in the next hour if he did not find a door. Marit looked at him. She looked at the man who had mocked her in front of freighters, who had threatened to take her children, who had cut her rope in the dark, who had called her shelter, a parlor for ghosts. She opened the door wider. Cass came in. He did not thank her. He sat on the floor near the sealed stove and shook until his body remembered what warmth felt like. Marit gave him the last heated stone and a scrap of blanket. He held the stone in his bare hand and said nothing. The coach now held 4 people, 1 dead stove, and not enough food for the day. By mid-morning, it held 6. Mercy Vale came through the bluff trail carrying her youngest daughter, Nell, wrapped in every piece of cloth Mercy owned. Nell was 4 years old and her lips were blue. Their cabin door had blown open in the night. The latch had failed, and by the time Mercy got it closed, the temperature inside had dropped below anything the stove could recover from. She had tried to wait it out. She had tried to build the fire higher. The stove cracked at the seam and began leaking smoke. She wrapped Nell and walked. The trail from Mercy's cabin to Tallow Bluff was less than a mile. It took her 90 minutes. She crawled the last 200 yards because the wind would not let her stand. Marit took Nell from Mercy's arms. The child was breathing, barely. Her fingers were white. Marit carried her past the curtain into the cave air, 51 degrees still, no smoke, and held her against her own chest while Eli wrapped heated cloth around the child's hands. 6 people in a space built for 3, 1 enemy, 1 skeptic turned ally, 2 sick children, no fire, a candle leaning inward at the vent. The second day of the blizzard was the longest of Marit's life. She rationed beans. She heated stones on the stove during brief moments when the wind shifted and the candle leaned outward. 10 minutes here, 15 there, building small, fast fires and killing them the moment the flame reversed. Each fire gave her 5 or 6 hot stones. Each stone held warmth for an hour. She rotated them among the children and Cass, whose bare hand had swelled and whose fingers had turned the yellow-white that meant the flesh was dying. The drainage trench began to ice. Moisture from 6 breathing bodies condensed on the cold stone walls and ran down into the trench, where it froze in a thin line. If the ice built up, the trench would block and water would pool on the cave floor. Marit used warmed stones to melt the ice line every few hours, pressing them against the stone channel until the water ran free again. Barbro had not taught her this. Barbro had not imagined 6 people sheltering at once. Marit solved it the way she solved everything, by watching what was happening and doing the next thing the problem demanded. Cass lay against the coach wall and watched her work. He did not speak. He did not help. He watched a woman he had tried to destroy manage a crisis he had caused by walking to her door. Nell's color came back by the afternoon. Eli's cough eased in the still cave air, where no wind stirred dust or smoke into her lungs. Tullif fell asleep on the cave floor and did not wake until morning, which was the deepest sleep he had managed in a month. On the 3rd morning, the wind dropped. It did not stop gradually. It stopped the way a voice stops mid-sentence. Sudden, total, strange. The silence after 3 days of howling was louder than the storm itself. Marit opened the coach door and saw a world made of white. Snow banked against the outer wall 3 feet high, packed hard by wind, but not a flake had crossed the threshold. The clay skin was intact. The moss gaskets had not shifted. The stone hearting stood where Barbro had placed it, dense, locked, indifferent. Marit held the candle to the vent. The flame leaned outward. The cave was breathing again. She built a fire. The stove drew. Smoke rose, hit the vent gap, and vanished. The coach interior warmed. Water from the heated pot steamed. Eli drank first, then Tullif, then Nell, who had fallen asleep in Mercy's lap and woke to the smell of boiling cornmeal. Cass drank last. He held the tin cup in his swollen hand and looked at the wall that had kept him alive. He looked at the moss gaskets. He looked at the stone hearting. He looked at the vent gap where the cave breathed outward as if the blizzard had never happened. He did not say thank you. He finished the cornmeal and set the cup down and closed his eyes. Outside, the territory counted its dead. Amos Breyer was found on the 4th day. He had tried to reach a neighbor named Edwin Marr, whose dugout vent cover had clogged with drifted snow. Amos had walked into the storm because he was the kind of man who walked into storms. It was the same impulse that had made him ride to Marit's claim to tell her she was going to die. He wanted to save people, even when saving them meant stating facts they did not want to hear. He was alive. Barely. They found him face down in a drift 100 yards from Marr's door, his fingers frozen to the scarf he had wrapped over his face. His left hand would never fully close again. His feet would hurt for the rest of his life. Marr's wife, Constance, was not found in time. She had gone out to clear the vent from outside when it clogged, and the wind had taken her. Edwin found her the next morning, 30 feet from the door. She had been facing the wrong direction. The blizzard of January 1887 killed cattle across the northern plains by the thousands. Ranchers who had grazed open range lost everything. Dugouts failed. Cabins cracked, stovepipes split, vent covers blew, water froze in buckets set beside stoves that were burning at full draw. Inside a wrecked stagecoach sealed into a limestone cave with moss, stone, and clay, 2 women, 1 man, and 3 children had survived without a working fire for most of 72 hours. The tin cup in the cave had never frozen. The deepest temperature inside the coach had been 39 degrees during the worst of the wind reversal. In the cave pocket behind the coach, the temperature had not dropped below 48. Marit Brecka Calder had not beaten the storm. She had refused to fight it on its terms. She had let the stone do what stone does, hold what the world wastes. And she had lived inside the difference between 50 degrees and 50 below zero. The coach door opened onto a white world that smelled of nothing because the cold had killed every scent. Marit stood in the opening and breathed air so sharp it cut her throat. Behind her, Eli was writing on the slate, Inside cup liquid, outside bucket stone. The storm was over. The shelter had held, and every person in the territory who had heard Reuben Cass call it a parlor for ghosts now knew what it actually was, a door that the wind could not open. The first person to come after the storm was not a neighbor and not a friend. It was a freighter named Grohl, the same man who had stood by the salt pork barrel the day Cass mocked Marit, the same man who had staggered into town, frost-burned the day the blizzard struck. Grohl had a freight wagon and a reputation for keeping his mouth shut, and he had lost part of his stock shed roof in the storm. He did not come to congratulate Marit. He came because a wall of his shed had cracked along the chinking line, and he could feel the wind through it when he pressed his hand flat, and he had heard from Sullivan, the road driver who had refused to lend his ox team, that the widow at Tallow Bluff had sealed a cave mouth with a stagecoach and stone and survived 3 days without fire. He stood at the bluff trail and stared at the coach the way a man stares at something he cannot fit into the shape of the world he already knows. "I need to know how you sealed the gaps," Grohl said. Marit could have turned him away. He had watched Cass insult her and done nothing. He had stood silent. But standing silent was not the same as laughing, and Marit had learned in the storm that survival was not a thing you could hoard. Hoarding survival made you Cass. Sharing it made you the person Barbro had been when she rode down the bluff trail with a block and tackle. She showed him the wall. She showed him the stone harding, big stones bridging the gap, small stones locking between them, clay binding. She showed him the moss gasket, dry moss packed against wood before the clay skin went on. She showed him the vent gap and lit the candle and let him watch the flame lean outward. "The moss is the part that matters," Marit said. "Clay cracks. Moss compresses. If your chinking is failing, pull the clay out of the crack, pack dry moss against the wood first, then reclay over the moss. The moss stops the draft. The clay stops the weather." Grohl touched the moss line the way Amos had, testing, pressing, looking for weakness. He found none. He nodded once, said he owed her a load of firewood, and left. He delivered the firewood the next day. 2 cords, split and stacked. It was more wood than Marit had owned at any point since Thomas's death. Mercy Vale's conversion was not a single moment. It was a tide. She had been inside the shelter during the storm. She had felt the still air. She had watched her daughter's lips change from blue to pink in the cave pocket where the temperature held above 48 degrees. She had seen Marit kill the fire when the smoke reversed, move the children deeper, heat stones on brief fires when the wind allowed, and manage 6 lives in a space built for 3 without panic and without waste. 2 days after the storm, Mercy came to the bluff carrying a pot of broth made from a chicken she could not afford to butcher, but butchered anyway. She set it on the coach step. "I told you that you were burying your children behind mud," Mercy said. "You did. I was wrong about the mud." She did not say she was sorry. Mercy was not a woman who apologized with words. She apologized by standing in the cold with a pot of broth and not leaving until it was accepted, and by coming back the next day, and the day after that, and every day for the rest of the winter, until her presence at the bluff was no longer charity or guilt, but simply the routine of 2 women who had survived something together and could not unsurvive it. Mercy asked questions. She asked how thick the wall needed to be. She asked why the moss had to be dry. She asked about the drainage trench, how deep, what angle, where the water went. She asked about the vent gap and the candle test and the smoke rule. She wrote nothing down because she could not write, but she repeated each answer aloud until it stayed. And she corrected herself when she got the order wrong. Big stones bridge, small stones lock, clay binds. Within a week, Mercy had re-chinked her own cabin door with dry moss under clay. and the draft that had driven her family out during the blizzard was gone. Amos Breyer arrived 12 days after the storm, walking slowly because his frozen feet would not bend properly, and his left hand was wrapped in linen that he changed every morning and tried not to look at. He had not come to praise. Amos did not praise. He had come to inspect, the way a man who has built 100 structures inspects the 101st, not because he expects it to be good, but because he needs to understand what he is looking at. Marit led him inside. She did not guide him. She let him see it for himself. He tapped the stone hearting with his good hand. He ran his finger along the moss gasket line. He checked the vent gap with his own candle stub. He knelt, painfully, his feet protesting, and examined the drainage trench, following it with his eye from the cave wall to the gravel pocket. He studied the sleeping platforms, the underseat storage, the stove position, the pipe angle. He opened and closed the coach door twice, testing the seal. He stood in the center of the coach interior and said nothing for a full minute. Then he walked past the flour sack curtain into the deeper cave, where the air was still and the temperature held steady, and he put his good hand on the limestone wall. "I called it a coffin," Amos said. "I was wrong. It's closer to a station than half the stations I kept on the Cheyenne Road." He paused. "The drainage is smarter than anything I built. The vent is a risk, but the candle test mitigates it. The stone hearting is better than most professional chinking I have seen." He came back through the curtain and looked at Marit. "Who taught you the hearting?" "Barbro Assen." "The midwife? The lime burner's daughter?" "She is more than a midwife." Amos sat on the sleeping platform, uninvited, but Marit did not stop him because a man with frozen feet who has walked a mile to see your wall has earned the right to sit. "I spent 11 years keeping people alive at road ranches," he said. "I built walls and chimneys and stock shelters and buried the ones I could not save. I told you the arithmetic was wrong because it was. It should not have worked. A coach body is thin wood and glass. The cave is raw rock. You should have frozen or smoked or drowned in thaw water." "But I did not." "You did not, because the cave does the work the walls cannot, and the walls do the work the cave cannot, and you understood that one does not replace the other." He looked at the vent gap. "The smoke rule, test before you trust. That is the part most people would have missed." "Barbro taught me that." "Then Barbro saved your life." Marit did not correct him. But Barbro had not saved her life. Barbro had shown her where to look. Marit had done the looking herself in the dark at midnight, with smoke pooling at the ceiling and her daughter coughing and the candle flame leaning the wrong direction. The looking was the part that could not be taught. Amos left. He returned 2 days later with a question. Could the moss gasket method work in an old station cellar he had access to, where the stone walls wept in spring and the chinking had failed? Marit told him it could. She described the method. Amos listened without interrupting, which was how Amos showed respect. The neighbors came one at a time, then in clusters. A man named Peter Tveit, who ran cattle on the flat south of the bluff, asked how to chink a spring house so the water trough would not freeze. Marit showed him the moss gasket and recommended he pack the exterior with straw clay cob over stone hearting. He brought his wife, who took notes on a piece of wrapping paper. A road ranch keeper 2 hours east sent his son to ask about the storm vestibule concept. A 2-layer entry, canvas flap outside, solid door inside, with a dead air pocket between them that broke the wind before it reached the living space. Marit described the design. The son repeated it back. The road ranch built one before the next storm and reported that the temperature in the front room held 15 degrees warmer than it had during the blizzard. Edwin Marr came. He came quietly. a man who had lost his wife because a vent cover blew off a dugout, and he stood in Marit's shelter and looked at the vent gap that could not blow off because it was not a cover. It was a gap in stone, controlled by pressure, tested by candle. He did not say Constance's name. He did not need to. Everyone in the cave coach knew why he was there. Marit showed him everything. She showed him the candle test, the moss gasket, the drainage trench, the stone hearting. She showed him how to slope the trench, how to test the draw, how to kill a fire when the vent reversed. She did not charge him. She did not ask for favors. She showed him because Constance Marr had died 30 feet from her own door, and the vent that killed her was a problem Marit knew how to solve, and knowing how to solve a problem and refusing to share it was a kind of murder she would not commit. Marit shared freely because hoarding knowledge would make her Cass. Every family she taught was a family that would not lose a wife in a storm. Cass did not convert. He recalculated. The blizzard had cost him more than frozen fingers. It had cost him his story. He had spent months building the narrative of Marit Brekke Calder as a grieving widow gone mad, a woman who needed saving from herself, whose children needed placing, whose claim needed a competent man to manage it. The blizzard had replaced that story with another one, a woman who had built a shelter from wreckage and stone that held when real cabins cracked, who had opened her door to the man who tried to ruin her, who had kept 6 people alive without fire for most of 3 days. Cass could not compete with that story, so he tried to steal it. He told people the coach had saved them. Not Marit's design, not the wall, not the vent or the drainage or the moss gaskets. The coach, company property, Crown and Finch's abandoned asset, which Marit had merely occupied. He said this at Door's store. He said it at the roadhouse. He said it to anyone who had not been inside the shelter and could not contradict him. It worked on some people. It did not work on the people who mattered. Barbro Asen had not appeared at the bluff since before the storm. Marit found her on a Tuesday, 5 days after the blizzard broke, sitting in the single room she rented from a German widow in the settlement. The room was cold. The stove was lit, but the chimney drew poorly, and a film of smoke sat at ceiling height like a gray lake inverted. Barbro sat in a chair near the stove with a blanket over her knees and her hands folded in her lap. She looked smaller. That was the first thing Marit noticed. Barbro had always been a tall woman, not heavy, but upright, the kind of woman whose presence filled a doorway. Now she sat folded inward, as though something inside her had collapsed and the exterior had not caught up. "You survived?" Barbro said. "We all survived. 6 of us." 6? Marit told her about Cass, about Mercy and Nell, about the smoke reversal and the candle and the stones heated on brief fires. Barbro listened with her eyes closed, and when Marit described killing the fire at the first inward lean of the flame, Barbro smiled. It was a small smile, aimed at something Marit could not see, a memory, perhaps, of her father's lime kiln where the same rule applied. Test the draw before you trust the fire. "You remembered," Barbro said. "I remembered because you taught it the way my father taught it. You did not explain it. You made me do it." Barbro opened her eyes. "Come back tomorrow. I have something to show you about lime wash." The weeks after the blizzard were the deepest part of Marit and Barbro's collaboration. Barbro could no longer ride to the bluff. The cough had settled into her chest like a permanent resident, and the cold ride to the road ranch had broken something in her lungs that would not mend. So Marit came to her. Every second day, she walked to the settlement, sat in Barbro's smoky room, and learned. Barbro taught lime wash. She taught Marit to burn limestone chips in the stove, slow, hot, patient, until they crumbled to powder. Mix the powder with water, strain it through cloth. Brush the liquid onto damp stone walls inside the cave where mold grew in the dark spots. The lime wash killed mold, dried the surface, and reflected candlelight so the cave interior was brighter than the raw stone. My father washed the inside of every kiln with lime slurry between burns, Barbro said. It sealed the surface, kept moisture from creeping into the stone and cracking it when the fire came. Same principle inside your cave. The stone weeps in warm air because the cold moisture trapped inside migrates to the warm surface. Lime wash seals the surface. The stone can weep behind the wash, but the water runs down the seal to the trench instead of dripping on your flour. They improved the shelter together. Barbro designed a removable storm shutter from coach panel scraps, a wooden frame with moss-packed canvas that could be fitted over the vent gap during the worst winds and removed when the air cleared. She designed a 2-layer entry improvement, the existing canvas flap outside, the coach door inside, and between them a dead air pocket a foot deep that killed wind speed before it reached the living space. Marit pushed back on one of Barbro's designs. Barbro wanted to seal the upper vent entirely during extreme cold and rely on opening the coach door briefly every few hours to cycle air. Marit refused. If the door freezes shut, we have no air, Marit said. The vent stays open. The vent is the cave's breath. If we seal it, we are sealing the cave's lungs. The vent is also the path for smoke and crosswind. It nearly killed your daughter. And I managed it. I killed the fire. I moved the children. The vent did not fail. I failed to watch the candle closely enough. That is a problem I can fix. Sealing the vent is a problem I cannot undo once the door freezes. They argued for an hour. Barbro was accustomed to being right. She had been right about the moss gaskets, right about the stone hearting, right about the drainage trench, and right about the smoke rule. She was not accustomed to a student who argued back with better reasoning than her own. In the end, Barbro conceded. Not gracefully. She said, "You are stubborn and you are correct, which is the worst combination a teacher can face." Marit laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since Thomas died. Barbro's backstory came in pieces during these weeks, offered the way a person offers fragments of a broken thing they no longer need whole. Her father had burned lime in Stavanger, hot, dangerous, underpaid work that left him with scarred hands and a cough that took him at 53. Her first husband had built root cellars in Minnesota using techniques Barbro's father had taught her, and when he died of cholera, she had finished 3 cellars alone because the families who commissioned them needed them before winter. Her second husband had been a carpenter who drank because he could not match his wife's competence with stone, and it shamed him. She did not mourn him. She mourned the waste of a man who could have learned if his pride had allowed it. I came west because my sister's family was here, Barbro said. They did not want me. A woman alone who knows more than the men around her is not a welcome guest. But I stayed because there was work, babies to deliver, cellars to dig, walls to fix, and because leaving would have meant admitting my sister was right, that I was too much trouble to keep. She said this without bitterness. She said it the way she said everything, as fact, stripped of decoration, offered for use. Barbro died on a Thursday in late February. Marit had visited the day before. They had discussed cold storage shelves. Barbro recommended digging a shallow shelf 2 feet above floor level in the deeper cave, where the steady temperature would keep salted meat and root vegetables through spring. Barbro had drawn the design on a piece of wrapping paper with a charcoal stub, her hand steady, her lines precise. She coughed between drawings, but did not stop. The German widow sent a boy to the bluff the next morning. Barbro had not come to breakfast. The widow found her in the chair by the stove, blanket over her knees, hands folded. The stove had gone out during the night. The room was cold. Barbro looked like she had fallen asleep, and the sleep had simply deepened past the point of return. Marit did not go to the settlement immediately. She stood at the cave mouth and looked at the wall Barbro had taught her to build. The stone harding, the moss gaskets, the clay skin cracked in two places from freeze-thaw, already patched with the layered technique Barbro had demonstrated when the first section failed. Every inch of the wall held Barbro's knowledge, pressed into the stone the way the moss was pressed into the joints, invisible, structural, the thing that kept everything else from falling. She went. She sat with Barbro's body until the men came to carry her. She took the wrapping paper drawing of the cold storage shelf and folded it into her coat pocket. She took the charcoal stub. She left everything else because Barbro had owned almost nothing, and what she had owned she had already given away, to Marit, to the families she had delivered, to the stone and lime that held her father's knowledge. They buried Barbro Asen in the frozen ground east of the settlement. Marit dug for 2 hours because the gravedigger wanted $3, and Marit had 4. Amos came and dug with his one good hand until Mercy arrived and took the shovel from both of them. They buried her without a minister because the circuit rider was 3 weeks out, and Marit said the only words spoken at the grave. She watched me reset a slipped roller instead of crying over it, and she decided I was worth her time. Everything I built she taught me to look at first. The looking was her gift. The building was mine. The wind crossed the cemetery and moved the dead grass, and Merritt went back to the bluff. That evening, she scratched Barbro's name into the inside of the coach door with the awl Thomas had left her, beside the first candle mark she had made the night the vent drew properly. The letters were rough, cut into the wood grain the way a name is cut into stone, not for beauty but for permanence. Then she built a fire, tested the vent, fed her children, and sat in the cave listening to the limestone breathe. The stone held what the world wasted. Barbro had taught her that. The stone did not grieve. The stone did not stop. The stone held. The thaw came in late March, and it came angry. 3 weeks of warming air melted the snowpack on the bluffs above the settlement. Water that had been locked in ice since January released all at once, running down draws and ravines in sheets that cut new channels through frozen ground. The creeks rose. The stage road turned to mud deep enough to swallow a wheel hub. The bluff face above Tallow Bluff wept with meltwater that ran in streaks down the limestone and pooled at the base of Merritt's wall. The drainage trench caught it, most of it. The trench ran the water along the cave wall to the gravel pocket, where it seeped into the ground. But the volume was more than Barbro had designed for. She had built the trench for condensation and light rain, not for the runoff of a catastrophic blizzard snowmelt. And on the third day of the thaw, water backed up along the trench and began pooling on the cave floor. Marit dug the trench deeper. She widened it with the pry bar in her hands. Eli carried gravel from the creek bed to extend the seepage pocket. Tollef hauled mud out in the cracked iron pot. They worked for a day, and the water level dropped, and Merritt thought she had solved it. Then Edwin Marr's boy came running. The dugout on the south flat, the one Edwin had rebuilt after the blizzard, with the new vent cover and the re-chinked walls, had partially collapsed. Meltwater had cut behind the south wall during the night, carving a channel through the sod and earth that supported the roof timbers. The wall had slumped inward. The roof sagged. The family was inside: Edwin, his 2 surviving children, and his mother, who had come from Rapid City after Constance's death to help with the children. Marit did not hesitate, and she did not wait for help. She put on her coat and walked to the Marr dugout, 1.5 miles across ground that sucked at her boots with every step. The south wall was gone. Not collapsed, dissolved. The sod had absorbed water until it lost its structure, and the earth behind it had washed out in a slurry that now covered the dugout floor in a layer of cold mud. The roof timbers sat on the remaining walls, at an angle that said they would hold for hours, not days. Edwin stood inside with a shovel, digging mud away from the base of the north wall, which was still holding but would not hold if the water continued to undercut it. "Get your family out," Marit said. "If I leave, the north wall goes." "If the north wall goes while you are inside, you die under your own roof." Edwin looked at her. He was a man who had lost his wife to a vent cover and rebuilt his home in the weeks after, and the prospect of losing the home too was more than his face could hold. He was not crying. He was beyond crying. He was in the place where loss becomes so routine that the body stops responding to it and simply continues the last motion it was given. "Get your children and your mother to my shelter," Marit said. "I will brace the wall." She did not know how. Barbro would have known. Barbro would have looked at the wall and seen the solution the way a doctor looks at a wound and sees the suture line. But Barbro was in the ground east of the settlement, and Marit was standing in a collapsing dugout with mud to her ankles, and the next thing the problem demanded was happening now. She sent Eli to fetch Mercy. She sent Tollef to the settlement to find Amos, who could barely walk but could direct work from a chair. She commandeered 2 reluctant townsmen who had come to gawk at the collapse. A farrier named Quick and a hay cutter whose name she never learned, and she set them to cutting drainage trenches on the uphill side of the dugout, diverting meltwater away from the south wall. The bracing she figured out herself. Cribbing. The same principle Barbro had taught her for moving the coach. Lift an inch, block an inch. She set pine logs vertically under the sagging roof timbers, each one wedged tight with flat stones at the base and shims of split wood at the top. She braced the north wall with angled supports dug into the mud floor. She packed the base of the surviving walls with stone. Not clay, not sod stone, because stone did not dissolve in water and did not compress under load. It was ugly. It was crude. It held. Amos arrived on a borrowed horse, his feet wrapped in double linen, and watched Marit direct Quick and the hay cutter from inside the dugout. He watched her stop Quick from packing wet clay against the north wall's base. "Stone first," Marit said. "Clay binds. Stone holds. If you put clay against wet sod, the clay absorbs the water, and both walls fail. Stone against the sod, clay over the stone." Quick looked at Amos. Amos nodded. Quick packed stone. "She sounds like Barbro," Amos said to Mercy, who had arrived with a coil of rope and 2 blankets. "She sounds like herself," Mercy said. Barbro taught her the words. She learned the sentences on her own. The Marr family spent 3 nights in Marit's Stagecoach shelter, while the drainage trenches diverted the worst of the meltwater, and the bracing held the dugout together long enough for the ground to stabilize. Edwin's mother, a woman named Annika, who had come from Rapid City expecting to find frontier squalor, sat inside the coach and touched the moss gasket line and asked how it was done. Marit showed her. Annika asked if it could be used to seal the root cellar in Rapid City, where her winter stores spoiled every spring from moisture. Marit said it could. The method was spreading, not by newspaper, not by lecture, not by reputation, by hands. One person touched the wall, asked a question, carried the answer home, and built it into their own shelter. The innovation was small enough to fit inside a conversation, and large enough to change how a family survived a winter. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the weather turns. Cass made his move during the thaw, while Marit was occupied with the Marr dugout. He rode to Deadwood with a paper he had prepared claiming that Crown and Finch had never formally abandoned the coach body, that the company had stripped mail fittings and hardware for transport efficiency, but retained ownership of the chassis. The paper bore a signature Marit had never seen from a company representative she had never met. Cass filed it with the territorial register and returned to the settlement carrying a copy that he showed to Dorr, to Sullivan, and to any freighter who stopped long enough to listen. The claim was simple. Marit Brecke Calder had occupied company property, improved it without authorization, and owed Crown and Finch the appraised value of the improvements or the return of the coach. If she could not pay, the claim including all improvements, meaning the shelter itself, would revert to the company's agent. Cass, of course, was the company's agent. The paper gave Marit 30 days. Mercy brought the news to the bluff on a morning when the mud was drying and the first green shoots were pushing through the brown grass. She brought it the way she brought everything, directly, without softening, because Mercy believed that a woman who had survived a blizzard in a stagecoach did not need to be protected from information. Cass has paperwork, Mercy said. He says the company never abandoned the coach. Marit set down the lime wash brush she was using on the interior cave wall. Her hands were white with lime. Her face was thin, thinner than it had been in the fall. The months of labor and rationed food visible in the sharpness of her jaw and the depth of her eyes. The company stripped it and left it, Marit said. Sullivan saw them leave it. Grohl saw it sitting on the ground for 2 months before I touched it. Cass has a signature from a company man. Cass has a signature from a man he paid. I have witnesses who saw the company walk away. She said it calmly. She was not calm, but she had learned from the blizzard, from the smoke reversal, from the collapsing dugout, that the moment you feel panic is the moment you test the candle, not the moment you feed the fire. 30 days, Mercy said. Then we have 30 days. The question was not whether Marit could fight Cass. The question was whether the people she had helped would stand beside her when standing cost them something. Grohl owed Cass for freight supplies. Sullivan owed him for ox feed. Peter Tveit traded through Cass's store because there was no other store within a day's ride. To testify against Cass was to risk their own credit, their own livelihoods, their own standing in a territory where one man's ledger held half the debts. Marit did not ask them. She went back to the cave and finished the lime wash. She built a cold storage shelf from Barbro's drawing, digging it into the cave wall 2 feet above floor level with the pry bar and lining it with flat stones. She patched 2 clay skins that had cracked in the thaw, replacing the outer layer with fresh cob mixed with chopped straw. She marked the smoke behavior with candle tests every morning, recording the wind direction and the flame lean on Eli's slate. She worked. She had always worked. The candle would tell her which way the wind was blowing. The rest was stone. The hearing was held in Deadwood on a Wednesday in late April in a room above a hardware store that smelled of linseed oil and cut iron. A territorial justice named Orrin Flint rode circuit through the Black Hills settlements twice a year, and his spring pass coincided with the 30-day window Cass had triggered. Flint was a lean man who wore a vest too large for him and listened without expression, and he had a reputation for 2 things. He did not tolerate fraudulent claims, and he did not tolerate wasted time. Marit's case was third on his docket after a mining boundary dispute and a livestock theft accusation. Cass arrived with the paper. He presented his case in the voice he used at the store. Reasonable, patient, the voice of a man who was merely pointing out an irregularity. The coach body, he explained, was Crown and Finch property. The company had removed hardware and fittings for transport, but had retained ownership of the chassis. Mrs. Calder had occupied the chassis without authorization and made improvements that now constituted part of a dwelling. The company, through its authorized agent, requested either compensation for the chassis at appraised value or the return of the property with improvements intact. The signature on the paper belonged to a man named Dole, whom Cass described as a Crown and Finch representative in Cheyenne. Justice Flint looked at the signature. He looked at Cass. He asked whether Dole was present to testify. Cass said Dole was unable to travel. Flint set the paper aside and asked Marit to present her account. Marit did not present it. She had no lawyer. She had no paper. She had something Cass had not expected. She had the people who had been inside the shelter when it mattered. Amos Breyer went first. He walked to the front of the room on feet that still hurt from the blizzard and stood with his left hand, the one that would never fully close, held at his side. He told the justice that he had been a road station keeper on the Cheyenne to Deadwood line for 11 years. He told him that he had inspected the wrecked coach in the weeks after the accident, and that Crown and Finch had stripped it publicly, in daylight, in front of the settlement. He told him the company had declared it unsalvageable and left it where it lay. "I watched them strip it," Amos said. "Lamps, brass, mail fittings, usable wheels. They took what had value and left what did not. The body sat on open ground for 2 months before Mrs. Calder touched it. No company man came back for it. No notice was posted. No claim was registered. I have built stations for 11 years. When a company abandons a coach body on the ground and walks away, it is abandoned." Flint asked if anyone else had witnessed the stripping. Sullivan, the road driver who had refused more at his ox team because Cass held his account, stood up. He had come to Deadwood without telling Cass. He told the justice he had seen the Crown and Finch crew strip the coach and load the fittings onto a company wagon. He told him the crew foreman had said, in Sullivan's hearing, that the body was not worth the hauling. Cass's face did not change, but his hands, resting on his knees, tightened. Grohl testified next. He was brief. He said the coach body had sat on the ground from October through late November without any company marker, any posted claim, any fence or cover. He said he had driven freight past it 4 times in that period, and that it had been open to weather, animals, and anyone who wanted it. Then Mercy Vale stood. She did not have testimony about the company. She had testimony about the shelter. She told the justice that she had been inside the cave coach during the blizzard of January 1887. She told him that the shelter had held 6 people for 3 days, including her 4-year-old daughter, who had arrived with blue lips and left with pink ones. She told him that the shelter was not a coach. It was a stone-walled, moss-sealed, ventilated dwelling that used the coach body as a structural element within a design that included drainage, temperature management, and smoke control. She told him that building a coach into a cave wall was like building a window into a house. The window is part of the house, but the window maker does not own the house. Flint looked at Mercy for a moment longer than he had looked at the other witnesses. Then he looked at Cass. "Mr. Cass," Flint said, "you were present inside the shelter during the storm. Is that correct?" Cass had not expected the question. Testimony about his own rescue was not part of the case he had prepared. He said yes. "Did the coach body alone keep you alive?" The room waited. Marit watched Cass's hands on his knees. She watched the calculation move across his face, the way weather moves across a prairie, visible from a distance, arriving in its own time, impossible to stop. "No," Cass said. "The wall did." 3 words. They cost him more than the $12.60 Marit owed his store. They cost him the story he had built about who she was and what she had done. They cost him the narrative of a grieving widow gone mad, of a woman who needed saving, of a claim that deserved a competent man. The wall did. Not the coach, not the company, not Cass. The wall. Justice Flint ruled in 90 seconds. The coach body had been publicly abandoned by company action. Mrs. Calder had improved it through her own labor using her own materials. The improvements constituted a dwelling. The dwelling belonged to Mrs. Calder. The claim filed by Cass, acting as agent for Crown and Finch, was dismissed. Flint added, without being asked, that the signature of a man named Dole, who was unable to travel and unable to testify, was not a signature he would accept again. Cass left the room before Marit did. He did not look at her. He walked down the stairs and into the Deadwood Street and disappeared into the crowd of men and mules and freight wagons that moved through the town like blood through a vein. He did not become kind. He did not become a different man. He became a man who could not lie about one specific thing, and that one thing, the wall did, followed him back to the settlement like a debt he could not discharge. Marit walked out of the hardware store into April sunlight. Amos was waiting on the boardwalk. Mercy was holding Nell. Sullivan was already walking toward the livery. Grohl had left without a word, because Grohl did everything without a word. "It is done," Amos said. "The hearing is done. The work is not." She went back to the bluff. There was lime wash to finish and a cold storage shelf to line. The spring of 1887 brought people to Tallow Bluff, the way thaw brings water down a hillside, following the path of least resistance toward the lowest, most useful place. Peter Tveit brought his wife and his oldest son to see the shelter. They walked through it slowly, touching the walls, studying the vent, watching Marit demonstrate the candle test. Tveit's wife asked whether the moss gasket method could be used in a log cabin where the chinking failed every second winter. Marit said it could. She showed them the pattern. Dry moss packed tight against the wood, clay over the moss, stone chips wedged behind the clay in the widest gaps. She made Tveit's son do it himself on a test section of the cave wall, correcting his hands the way Barbro had corrected hers, not by explaining what was wrong, but by showing what was right. The road ranch keeper who had sent his son for the storm vestibule design came himself. He was a German named Fassbinder who had run stock stations in Nebraska before moving to the Black Hills, and he had the practical intelligence of a man who had spent his life keeping buildings standing in places where buildings did not want to stand. He spent an hour inside the cave coach and asked Marit 17 questions, each more specific than the last. What was the clay to sand ratio in the cob mix? How deep was the drainage trench at the shallowest point? What was the minimum wall thickness that held during the blizzard? How did the vent perform in a sustained crosswind versus a gusting crosswind? Marit answered each one. She answered with the numbers Eli had recorded on the slate and transferred to a small ledger Mercy had given her. A record of temperatures, wind directions, flame behaviors, wall thicknesses, and repair dates that read like the logbook of a ship navigating a sea made of stone and cold. Fassbinder asked if he could copy the ledger entries for the vent performance data. Marit let him. He brought her a smoked ham in return, and Eli recorded the trade in the ledger alongside the temperature reading for the day. 3 families along the local road rebuilt their chinking that spring using moss gaskets under clay. 2 of them added stone harding to the weakest wall sections. 1 family, a couple named Strand who had lost their stock shed roof in the blizzard, built a full stone-hearted storm vestibule at their cabin entrance based on Marit's description and Barbro's original design. Edwin Marr rebuilt his dugout with a proper drainage system, trenches on the uphill side diverting meltwater, stone-packed base walls replacing the sod that had dissolved. He added a vent gap at the roofline and tested it with a candle every morning for the rest of his life. Marit did not charge for any of it. She accepted labor instead. 1 day of hauling stone from every family she helped, The stone accumulated at the bluff base in a pile that grew through spring and summer, raw material for the improvements she was already planning. A second wall layer on the west side, a stone-lined water channel from the creek, an extension of the cold storage shelf. The cave coach was becoming something more than a shelter. It was becoming a school. Families brought children to watch the candle test. Mercy brought her oldest daughter to learn the moss gasket pattern. Amos sent a message to a road ranch keeper south of Rapid City describing the method, and the keeper sent a letter back asking for measurements. The knowledge spread the way useful knowledge has always spread on a frontier, hand to hand, wall to wall, quietly, without credit, without ceremony, carried by people who had touched the stone and felt it hold. Wesley Marr arrived at Tallow Bluff in June of 1887, 3 months after the hearing and 5 months after his cousin Edwin's wife had died in the blizzard. He was 39, a wagon repairman from Pierre who had come east to help Edwin with the children and the rebuilt dugout. He was a quiet man with square hands and a way of studying broken things before he touched them, turning a split spoke in his fingers, sighting down a bent axle, looking at the geometry of the failure before deciding how to fix it. He had been married once to a woman who died of typhoid in 1883, and he carried her loss the way Merritt carried Thomas's, not as a wound that bled, but as a weight that had become part of his body, distributed through the bones, present in every motion. Edwin sent him to the bluff to repair the coach door hinges. The leather straps that served as hinges had dried and cracked through the winter, and the doors no longer sealed properly. It was a simple job. Wesley could have done it in an hour. He spent a full day. He examined the hinges. He examined the door frame. He examined the seal between the door and the cave wall, the moss gasket line, the stone harding visible at the door's edge. He measured the gap between door and frame with a folded piece of paper, checking it at 6 points. Then he sat on a stone outside the cave mouth and thought. Marit watched him from inside, where she was lime-washing the back wall. "The hinges are simple," Wesley said when she came out. "New leather, proper stitching, they will hold a year. But the door frame is warped from the crash. It does not sit square. I can shim it, but the shim will compress the moss gasket on the hinge side and open a gap on the latch side. Then do not shim it. I can rebuild the frame, pull the old one, true it with a plane, reset it with new mounting points. Show me where the mounting points go." He showed her. He had drawn them on the door frame with charcoal, 4 points, evenly spaced, set back from the edge to allow the moss gasket room to compress without being crushed by the hinge hardware. "The gasket needs space," Marit said. "If the hinge pins sit too close to the stone, the door swing compresses the moss against the limestone, and the moss loses its spring. After 100 openings, the gasket is flat, and the seal is gone." Wesley looked at her. He looked at the marks he had drawn. He erased 2 of them and moved them a 1/4 inch inward. "Better," Marit said. "You know hinges." "I know moss." He rebuilt the door frame over 2 days. On the first day, Marit rejected his initial design because the bottom rail sat too low and would trap smoke against the floor during a vent reversal. He did not argue. He raised the rail 2 inches and tested the gap with the candle. The flame leaned outward. The draw was clear. On the second day, he asked her about the wall. She told him. She told him about the stone harding and the moss gaskets and the drainage trench and the candle test. She told him about Barbro. She told him about her father's cellar in Telemark. She told him about the tin cup that stayed liquid when the world froze solid. Wesley listened the way he studied broken things, completely, without interruption, turning the information in his mind the way he turned a split spoke in his hands. "The cave does the work the house cannot," he said. And the house does the work the cave cannot. Who said that? Amos Breyer. He meant it as criticism. I kept it as a design principle. Wesley laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of him, and Merritt realized it was the first time she had heard him make a sound that was not a question or an observation. He had a good laugh. It sounded like something that had been stored away for a long time and was glad to be used. He came back the next week to repair a crack in the coach floor panel, and the week after that to reinforce the sleeping platform supports, and the week after that with no repair needed at all, just a sack of dried apples and a question about whether the cold storage shelf could be extended to hold salted fish. The courtship happened through work. It happened through shared measurements, corrected designs, arguments about hinge clearance and drainage slope, and the proper angle for a stovepipe elbow. It happened because Wesley respected Marit's numbers the way he respected the geometry of a well-built wheel, not because she was a woman who needed accommodation, but because she was a builder who had earned her specifications through testing. He built a separate lean-to workshop near the bluff that autumn, a small structure for wagon repair with a proper workbench and tool storage. He did not build it inside the cave. He did not take over the shelter. He built beside it, the way a new wall is built beside an old one, parallel, supporting, not replacing. By the spring of 1888, Wesley had moved his tools to the bluff permanently. He ate supper with Marit and the children most nights. Eli recorded his arrival in the ledger with the same precision she recorded weather data. Wesley Marr. Dried apples. Stayed for broth. They married in the fall of 1888. The circuit rider performed the ceremony at the bluff, with Amos, Mercy, and Edwin standing as witnesses. Tolliff carried the bent pry bar that had first moved the coach, and Eli held the ledger, and the wind came across the bluff the way it always did, steady, searching, finding nothing to enter. Nigh. The years compressed the way years do when the crisis is over and the work becomes routine, not less difficult, but less desperate, the rhythm of maintenance replacing the frenzy of survival. Marit and Wesley added a second room, a proper framed addition built against the bluff face east of the cave mouth, with stone-hearted walls, a shingled roof, and a door that connected to the coach interior. The cave coach became the winter shelter and cold storage. The new room became the living space. The two structures shared a wall and a drainage system and the same limestone bluff that kept the wind from finding a way in. Eli grew into the record keeper the territory needed. She maintained the ledger through her teenage years, expanding it from temperature readings and repair dates into a full accounting of who had come, what they had asked, what Marit had taught them, and what the results had been. The ledger became a technical manual written in the language of a girl who had learned to count in a blizzard. Entries read like dispatches from a war. February 12, Tivit cabin west wall. Moss gasket replaced. Clay reskin, draft eliminated. Candle steady. March 4. Fassbinner road ranch vestibule, vent drawing poorly. Cleared ice blockage and upper gap. Flame restored outward. Tolliff learned wagon repair from Wesley and kept the original coach hinge. The one Wesley had rebuilt with the raised bottom rail, as a curiosity he showed to anyone who visited. He could explain the hinge clearance, the gasket compression, the smoke gap, and the reasons for each measurement. Though he had been 7 when most of it was built and remembered less the engineering than the feeling of carrying wedge stones smaller than his forearm, while his mother levered a 2,000-pound coach toward a dark opening in the rock. Merritt taught. She taught every family that asked and several that did not. Families she saw making mistakes she recognized, dugout walls packed with wet clay against wood, vent covers that could blow loose, chinking lines without moss gaskets. She walked to their claims and showed them. She did not lecture. She demonstrated. She put her hand on the wall and said, "Feel." She lit a candle and said, "Watch." She let the stone teach the lesson because the stone was more patient than she was and more persuasive than any voice. Within 2 winters of the blizzard, at least 9 families along the local road had copied part of her method: moss gaskets behind chinking, stone-hearted clay seals on the weakest wall sections, storm vestibules with dead air pockets, candle-tested vents, raised sleeping shelves to keep bedding above floor-level cold, drainage trenches sloped away from living spaces. The innovations were small individually. Together they amounted to a vocabulary, a shared language of survival that passed between homesteads like a dialect, changing the way people talked about cold and wind and stone. The cave coach shelter at Tallow Bluff became a stopping place. Not an inn, Marit did not charge and did not want to. A place where people came to see a thing that worked and to understand why it worked and to carry that understanding home. The candle test was the part everyone remembered. Hold the flame near the gap. Watch the lean. Inward means danger. Outward means draw. A 50-cent candle that could save a family. 3 road ranches built stone and clay storm vestibules after losing stock in the hard winter. 2 more added moss gaskets behind their existing chinking. Amos used Marit's method to retrofit an old station cellar on the Cheyenne Road, and the cellar held through 2 more winters without a single failed seal. He sent word to Marit that the moss was still compressed and dry after 18 months. She recorded it in the ledger. The method did not become famous. It became useful. The distinction mattered more than anyone outside the territory would have understood. Famous meant a story in a newspaper that people read and forgot. Useful meant a wall that held when the wind came, built by hands that had been shown what to do by other hands that had learned it from stone. Years passed. The coach body lost its red paint to weather and time, the color fading from crimson to rust to the dull gray of wood that has forgotten it was ever anything but wood. The leather strap suspension, still attached to nothing, hung from the undercarriage like the rigging of a ship that would never sail again. The glass, cracked since the wreck, was replaced by oiled cloth, then by new glass Wesley cut and fitted, then by oiled cloth again when a hailstorm broke the new glass. The coach did not care. It held its place in the cave mouth the way it had held it since Marit levered it there on pine rollers. Patient, structural, doing the work it had been given. A younger woman arrived at the bluff one autumn, years later, with 2 children and a face that Marit recognized without knowing her name. It was the face of a woman who had run out of choices and was looking for one more. She had come from the South, following a rumor she had heard from a freighter's wife, that a woman at Tallow Bluff could tell you how to live inside a rock. She stood at the cave mouth and looked at the coach, the stone walls, the vent gap, the drainage trench. She looked at Marit, who was older now and slower, whose hands were thick with years of gripping iron and pressing clay, whose face held the same sharpness Eli's had held during the blizzard. Not hunger anymore, but the permanent imprint of a time when every calorie mattered. "Can a cave be made safe?" the woman asked. Marit did not answer first. She reached into the shelf by the coach door and took out a candle, one of a box she kept there, always, the way another woman might keep a lamp or a key. She held it out. "Light it near the opening," Marit said. "Tell me which way the flame bends." The woman took the candle. She walked to the mouth of the cave. She lit it. The flame leaned outward, steady, patient. The cave breathing the same breath it had breathed when Marit first hung a scrap of flour cloth across the opening and watched it lift toward the sky. The woman looked back at Marit. Marit nodded. "Now you know the first thing," Marit said. "I will teach you the rest." Within 2 winters of the blizzard of 1887, 9 families along the road between Tallow Bluff and the Deadwood stage route had rebuilt part of their shelter using techniques Marit Brekke Calder taught them. Moss gaskets sealed behind chinking, stone-hearted clay walls bracing the weakest sections, candle-tested vents in every dugout and cabin within a day's ride. The innovation did not travel by newspaper or reputation. It traveled by hands, one family touching a wall, asking a question, and carrying the answer home to build into their own. Marit lived out her later years at Tallow Bluff, where the coach body held its place in the cave mouth long after the paint was gone and the leather straps had been replaced twice. Eli kept the ledger into adulthood, a record of temperatures, repairs, visitors, and lessons that filled 3 volumes before she married a surveyor from Rapid City and took the books with her. Tolliff saved the bent pry bar that had first moved the coach and hung it on the wall of Wesley's workshop, where it stayed until the workshop became a barn and the barn became a memory. Barbro Assen's name remained scratched into the inside of the coach door beside the first candle mark, the letters darkening with smoke and years until they looked less like writing and more like something the wood had always carried. The wind came across the bluff that last winter the way it had come the first, north-northwest, crossing the open prairie with nothing to slow it, finding the limestone face and pressing against it the way a hand presses against a door. The snow banked against the outer wall. The clay seams held dark against the white stone. Inside, the candle flame leaned outward. Reuben Cass had stood in Door's store and told the freighters she was building a parlor for ghosts. Children slept there. Fever broke there. Neighbors warmed their hands there. A man who called it a coffin built his own cellar by its design. A man who mocked it lived because its door opened. And a woman who had never built anything before she was 37 taught the territory that a wall is not a wall until the moss is in and the stone is set and the candle says the air is moving the right way. An old woman's hand held a candle near the clay seam, where the coach body met the limestone. The flame bent, steadied, and held. The wind had crossed the whole prairie looking for a crack, and Marit Brekke Calder had taught the stone not to give it one.